Hipper than hip was the way this one guy in New York City in the early 80s described himself. He was a guy who worked in the office I worked in, just south of Union Square on Broadway. He'd come into the office and talk about how he was hipper than hip. He mentioned that often. He mentioned Divine, the actor that he would go see in Pink Flamingos. And he mentioned these David Lynch movies he'd gone to see, sometimes at midnight at the Cinema Village on East 12th Street. I listened to him. I did not aspire to being hipper than hip, or maybe even hip. I'd never seen a Divine movie. I'd seen one David Lynch movie by the late 80s, Blue Velvet. I liked it fairly well. It was pretty creepy, but I liked it in some ways. But by the late 80s, I was kind of dispirited. I'd been living in New York for 6 or 7 years at that point. I was fairly young and resilient still. I was still in my 30s. I'd come to New York at 31 or so, feeling fairly hopeful about my prospects of getting published. By my late 30s, those hopes were tempering a bit. I was a seasoned New Yorker by then, meaning in a way I was kind of bitter. It was my observation that the only New Yorkers who were thoroughly happy to be in New York, thoroughly adjusted in New York, and really pleased to be there, were people who had grown up in New York, not transplants like Lonesome Lou and me. By the late 80s, I was living on 9th Avenue in the 40s in Hell's Kitchen. It was a temporary abode, as all of my abodes were in those days. An address not in my name, but in the name of someone else I knew or didn't know or was told about. In this case, a friend I'd known since high school who was an actor who was off in Denver or Pittsburgh with a part in a smaller theater setup than what he aspired to in New York. His hopes were dimming. He'd been in New York a long time. He'd drunk a lot, and he complained that he never got a part in a Eugene O'Neill play, even though he drank a bottle of whiskey a day. Unfortunately, he still looked baby-faced and sweet. Didn't look like an O'Neill character. Didn't get the parts. I hadn't been published. I'd had some close calls. I'd had an agent who was sure she was going to sell a couple of novels and didn't. When I was living on 9th Avenue at 48th, I think 695 9th Avenue, I had no girlfriend. I'd had no romance in quite some time. I was driving taxi cabs at night from about 4 or 5 in the afternoon till 4 or 5 in the morning. I'd take some days off to recuperate and sometimes to get a little culture. On this particular evening, I ventured forth from 695 9th Avenue to the Thalia Theater on the Upper West Side. Let's see, it was about 50 blocks to the Thalia from where I lived. I walked uptown, but I stopped along the way to eat my supper. And I stopped at a place I like to eat from time to time, the Chirping Chicken, part of a chain of Chirping Chicken restaurants. Now, you might have thought I wouldn't be crazy about eating at the Chirping Chicken because I had had a girlfriend earlier in the 80s who had dined with me a number of times at a Chirping Chicken franchise near where she lived on 75th Street on the west side. And I noted with some alarm after a meal with her where we'd both eaten chicken at this particular Chirping Chicken. When we finished, my bones were on my plate. Her bones were gone. I said to her, "Where'd your chicken bones go?" She said, "Oh, I ate them." That romance didn't last too long. I had a feeling just that our styles didn't match up so well. She was sadder than I was. She was an actress. She had gotten a big part in Hollywood some years earlier, and through no fault of her own, it had gotten away from her. The one that got away in a big movie that became a huge success. She was the second female lead. A new director brought in his two girlfriends to play the first and second female leads. And my friend of the future was relegated to the role of girl in disco, an onlooker. Life is full of these ones that got away. Parts for actors. The Grant Award, for which I was a finalist in the New York State CAPS grant sweepstakes. I was one of 80 finalists for 20 of these grants. That one got away. I never had it for it to get away, except that I started counting on it a little bit in one corner of my fantasies, and then had to retrench after not winning. So anyway, I sallied forth to the Chirping Chicken. I think it was on 9th Avenue, a little below 57th Street on the west side. I ate my usual chicken special there, and I chose, as I was eating, the particular condiment to go with it. They had a number of offerings, possibilities. I had that. It didn't taste too bad. I ate, and then I walked on north, the remaining 40 blocks or so, up to the Thalia, which was, I believe, at 95th Street and Broadway, around on 95th. It showed hip movies. My friend Lou would have been pleased to go to the Thalia to see something that was hip or hipper than hip. And I went to see something that he had actually recommended years earlier as being hipper than hip, which was a David Lynch movie. Not Blue Velvet, which I had seen and had somewhat enjoyed, in spite of its grassy suburban creepiness, but maybe because of that it was supposed to be creepy. The guy was creepy himself, David Lynch, presumably, and he picked creepy actors to be in his movies. Wholesome-looking actors who then would disintegrate as the movie progressed. That was my understanding anyway from seeing only one movie. This one had been a mainstream success. So I was going to see Eraserhead, which was David Lynch's first movie. And it had posters showing this guy with a bland expression and a great mass of hair, a kind of bouffant, backlit, whipped up mass of hair. That's all I knew about it. Eraserhead. Hipper than hip. And it was part of a double feature. After that, I was going to be treated to Elephant Man, another David Lynch picture, based on a real-life character, evidently. So I was going to see both of these for the price of one, and was going to be able to feel that I had done some catching up in the hipness department. At least I would have killed a few hours. But as I was walking the 40 blocks north from the Chirping Chicken on this warm summer evening in New York, a beautiful evening, a night for romance and adventure in New York, a perfect evening in New York City. As I was walking up 9th Avenue, and then after angling slightly to the left, up Broadway, I started to feel a slight queasiness inside. And I hadn't even gotten to the David Lynch movie yet. A queasiness coming, rising in vapors through my intestinal system, and I began to wonder about that condiment I'd put on my chicken south of 57th Street. Began to wonder a little bit about the chicken itself, how fresh it might have been. The perfection of the evening was thrown into a bit of question as I walked north. I got my ticket, I went inside, sat down, got a good location in the theater. I was a little early. The theater filled in around me. By now there were previews showing, and I wasn't really paying attention to anyone else. And as I sat through Eraserhead, which was a supremely gloomy movie, the gloomiest of movies I'd ever seen, and not one I particularly cared for, because I was not hipper than hip. As I sat through this movie, my unease intestinally was growing, and things were somewhat twisting inside me and emitting more queasy vapors that didn't make me wonder if I was going to be sick. That made me sure I was going to be sick and made me wonder when the sickness was actually going to hit as some sort of attack, some sort of outward eruption, either orally or otherwise in my system, because it was coming, I could tell. This was one chicken that was not working out well for me. And at some point during this gloomy film of David Lynch's, a black and white film seemingly shot in one of the gloomiest cities of Central Europe during its gloomiest period, probably right after the war. Industrial smokestacks, much in evidence, terrible air being ingested by all the characters, terrible looks being exchanged, fearful looks, implacable, incoherent dialogue, cryptic snatches of language, all in English, but it might as well have been in Czech or in lugubrious tones of some sort of Yugoslavian language that I had no inkling as to the meaning of. In the midst of this murky tale, there took place a date, a sort of socializing, the likes of which I had not experienced for quite some time. This main character, the guy with the whipped up hair, had a date with an attractive young woman. Now, she was a bit strange, and the other people where he showed up for dinner for his date were stranger still. The older woman, especially the older man, who presented our hero with this gloomy platter on which sat a little bird. A chicken, God bless us. A chicken, my second chicken of the evening, but this one an artistic rendering of a chicken. And he said, sliding the plate over to the young man, "Tonight you carve the bird." And the young man regarded this desiccated little bird dubiously, as he regarded everything. He was a very passive character. So he regarded the chicken in a passive way too, but he didn't trust it, and neither did I, sitting in the darkness of this theater with nausea rising in me. I looked at this chicken on the screen, and I felt my own chicken, which was chirping in its own way, sickly in my system. David Lynch would have loved my scene. I didn't. It made me gloomier than I had been already. I looked at this character with his sharp, pointed knife as he inspected the chicken on his plate and very hesitantly carved into it, and instantly there dribbled forth on the man's plate this oozy, viscous slime, this darkening puddle of blood. My gorge rose as I saw this. It was meant to, I'm sure. David Lynch meant for it to, but he hadn't known that I would be dining at Chirping Chicken first and would be setting my system up for this very moment. It was all I could do to hold my own liquids inside as this dark, oozy liquid poured forth from between the legs, no less, of this chicken. There are all sorts of deeply symbolic references to birth, childbirth. It was very heavy, this movie, with symbolism. Heavy, dark, black and white, gloomy. It was anti-childbirth by my dim lights. I sat and I watched the rest of the film. People around me, from some of their oohs and ahs as they got up, seemed to have thought it was brilliant. They said so. If they'd been a theater audience, they would have been on their feet for a standing ovation. And New Yorkers thought they were quite discerning in such matters, because they were the hippest in the country, after all. Possible exception of San Francisco dilettantes. But we in New York were supremely hip, especially Lonesome Lou, who had not had a girlfriend, which is why I thought of him as Lonesome Lou. Maybe that was part of hipness. In that case, I was hip myself, because I had no girlfriend. Right then, back in my days when I'd known Lou, I had had a girlfriend after another. There was a succession of abortive romances, aborted by me or by the other. They didn't work. We didn't match. We were simpatico at first, she and I, in each romance. But as time passed, as chickens were consumed, and I noticed the bones being eaten too. She did have an eating disorder by her own account, that woman who ate the bones of chickens. After several months, usually, we drifted apart. And now I was as hip as Lonesome Lou in that regard. The crowd thinned out. I was sitting in the center, so I had to wait. As I was about to rise and leave, because I knew I would never make it through another film, even if it was Elephant Man in all its David Lynch brilliance. I wouldn't make it through a Disney cartoon, the state I was then. So I was going to have to rise and leave and purge somewhere, preferably in private, not on the subway. I wasn't walking home those 50 blocks, that was for sure. I hoped I would make it home in passable shape so that I wouldn't disgrace myself or my trousers on the way home. As I was about to rise, I noticed that there was a woman sitting next to me. She hadn't risen either. She turned to me then, and she said in a lovely, low, soft voice, "Were you planning to stay for the second feature?" I looked at her, and she had a very nice face. She had prematurely white hair, but a young face. She might have been 5 years older than I was. I was 39 or so, 38, 37, somewhere in there. She might have been in her early 40s, but we were, roughly speaking, in the same phase of our life. She seemed very attractive, lovely soft voice, lustrous eyes, sympathetic look. She didn't know that I'd eaten a chirping chicken and that it was catching up with me. She didn't know anything except that I might or might not be staying for the second feature. I said, no, I can't stay for the second feature, I don't think. I think one David Lynch movie in an evening is as much as I can tolerate with my system. I'm a little hypersensitive that way. She chuckled and she said she felt the same way. She wasn't going to be able to stay for Elephant Man after all. I said I was planning to stay for Elephant Man. I was going to get the bargain, 2 for 1 and all that, but I can't do it now. I didn't say why. She said, I can't do it either. Would you like to go have a beer somewhere? Now, I loved the idea of having a beer with her somewhere. I loved the idea of being asked by an attractive woman to go have a beer with her. Who knew what else lay in store in that night of adventures in New York? To which my guts whispered, we know what's in store. Better not do it, Buster. You'll be in big trouble then. But I couldn't resist. She had asked, and I said, as passive as this poor duffer who was in this movie we had just suffered through, I said passively, I'd be delighted to go have a beer somewhere. And so we did. We retired to a bar on Broadway. I don't think I drank a beer. I think I drank bubbly water of some sort. I don't know if she thought that I was a reformed alcoholic or something, but I was trying to be kind to my system, as kind as I could be. I excused myself for one quick visit to the bathroom and came back in a few minutes. It hadn't been too disastrous. It hadn't been a triumph, but I was ready, I thought, for a little more of life. I wasn't feeling terribly hip, but I was feeling like I might make it through another 45 minutes of seemingly normal life on the surface. Now, this David Lynch movie, Blue Velvet, that I had liked somewhat, had been about the contradiction between what seems apparent in life and what is going on underneath, below the green grass of the world. It had been about that a lot when it came to human nature as well. It would have reveled in this contradiction of how calm I liked to think I appeared on the outside compared to the drama churning within me. David Lynch would have loved that. We chatted about this and that, films, New York City, politics, the AIDS epidemic, subjects dark and light. I told her I was cab driving, but that I had novels on the market that kept getting rejected. She seemed sympathetic. She'd heard that before, no doubt. It was part of life in New York. After a while, she put down her empty beer glass, and she said in a calm, level tone, would you like to come up to my place for a cup of coffee? I live nearby, just between Broadway here and West End. I said I'd love to. As the voices of despair and panic cried out within me, we can't last, they cried out, we can't make it. A cup of coffee, no, not tonight, no, we can't do it. And I said that would be very nice. And I walked in what I hoped was a normal manner with her on this beautiful summer evening. To her apartment we went up in the elevator. Her building had a doorman. This was civilized. None of the places I had lived in recently, certainly not 695 9th Avenue, had a doorman. 695 9th Avenue, the staircase smelled of cats, and not in a good way. But this building of hers did not smell of cats, fortunately. Or I might not have made it to her apartment without an incident. We went up in the elevator after she greeted the doorman in passing. He seemed friendly. She let me into her apartment. She had a small dog there, but it was well behaved. A little white yappy dog, but it wasn't yapping. It was perfect. It was well behaved. It regarded me with amiable satisfaction, it seemed. She cuddled with it a little bit and left it alone. Her mind seemed to be on other things. She went to get a coffee-making apparatus. I said, "Do you have any herbal tea?" I didn't want to sound like a feeble type drinking soda water and herbal tea, but I couldn't help myself. And she said, "Yes, I got some herbal tea here. I'll find you some. That'll be easy to do." She made herself a cup of coffee, made me some herbal tea. I absented myself to go to the bathroom again, and we sat and drank our caffeinated items. Hers had caffeine, mine did not. Mine was on the healthy side. It was on the careful side. We talked again about this and that. She had a very nice apartment. There were quality artworks on the walls. We talked about where we'd grown up. She'd grown up in Westchester County, which indicated to me she came from money. She seemed comfortable. I didn't ask how she made a living. I kind of had the sense she didn't have to make a living. Her apartment was fairly large, and she was the only one living there by all appearances, apart from the little white dog. I talked about having grown up in Ithaca, New York. I didn't brag about having been born in India. I wasn't blowing up an expansive image of myself. I didn't claim to be anything other than a cab driver who had written novels that had gotten rejected. To do more wouldn't have fit with my chirping chicken state of mind and my submissive, passive, whipped down feeling after seeing this dreadfully long David Lynch movie, Eraserhead. It had felt like it would never have ended. Then it had ended, but it hadn't. I was living it now. Time passed. It became apparent that nothing much was going to happen in addition to this drink down below and then drink up above and nice conversation at both locations. It didn't seem to be in the cards that romance would blossom that evening, that lust would blossom that evening, that lust was even possible. I knew was not the case. I knew I was ill. I wondered how green I looked around the gills by then. I felt green. I said finally, I think I'll have to be getting home now. I'd like to stay longer, but I really can't. I didn't say why. Maybe I should have. Maybe I should have taken her phone number, asked for it. I'm sure she would have been happy to offer it to me. She seemed to like me, in spite of everything, in spite of my lack of vim and healthiness. She said, "I think it's time I walked the dog." I forget its name. She told me its name. I couldn't remember it. 2 hours later, I remembered her name. This woman with lovely white hair and a lovely face and a lovely soft body, apparently. Everything about her was lovely. Her apartment, her clothes, her way of speaking. She was very kind. She would have given me her phone number if I had said, I'd like to call you sometime and get together again when I'm feeling a little better, but I'm a little under the weather tonight, and I think it wouldn't work out so well. If I'd said something like that, I'm sure she would have been open to it, this woman whose name was Bobby, as it happened. She did tell me her name. I remembered that, but I didn't ask for her phone number. So we ventured out of the apartment, all three of us this time. Doggy, Bobby, and I went down the elevator, went past the doorman out into the wonderful, balmy summer evening. They went for their walk. They headed right out the door, toward the park, toward West End Avenue, I don't know. I went left, toward the subway. I didn't walk home those 50 blocks. I took the subway, and I hoped it would get there in a hurry, because I needed to get home. And when I got home, I did explode. And then I went to bed, fell into bed, and stayed there for the next 36 hours, wondering if I was going to die or survive. It really did feel like the chirping chicken and David Lynch were going to kill me. The whole mess of that movie and that meal were going to conspire to do me in. But I did survive. And that's my life with New York City and attempting to be hipper than hip, like Lonesome Lou, my office mate from years before. I stayed merely hip, if that.